Sunshine, thank you so much for that most gracious introduction. It is such a privilege and honor to be here today with you, and greetings from the sunny South. Nice to be with you. I'm glad we've got some sunny weather today because I know y'all have had a little bit of cloudy weather previously this week. One of the things I wanted to say is my first time here to Narragansett, and I have to say, what a treasure. I have worked with folks at Narragansett. My first interaction with folks from the School of Oceanography here was at the Ishtok oil spill back in the 1970s, worked with some folks there. I also worked with some folks over at the EPA lab here at Narragansett at the Exxon Amoco Cadiz oil spill back in the 70s. So I have worked with folks a number of times. I had the great privilege of working with John Knaus, who was the Dean of Oceanography here for many years when he was head of NOAA, and had many, many good times with John when he would come to Charleston and visit. So I've really felt a real kinship with folks here, and I've interacted with a number of folks throughout the years in this region. The title of my talk today is Coastal Development and Climate Change, a Recipe for Disaster for Coastal Ecosystem and Human Health. And you certainly don't talk about something like that all on your own. I want to thank a cast of a bunch of people at NOAA, our Arnold School of Public Health, Environmental Canada, and then my good friend Tom Peterson at the National Climate Data Center, who's a member of the IPCC. So let's jump right into this. Urbanization in coastal ecosystems. Globally, 55% of the world's population lives in the coastal zone. 33 of the 50 largest cities in the world are located in the coastal zone. And in fact, 80% of the world's commerce is transported through coastal ports. So we clearly live in an area of the world where the coast is important. In the U.S., the statistics are very similar. Over 50% of the population lives in the coastal zone in an area that's only 11% of the land mass of this area of the U.S. And the population continues to grow. One of the most significant findings was a recent report by the Pew Commission that found that 25% of all land conversions in North America from rural to urban areas occurred for the last 300 years since we got here. Basically occurred from 1982 to 1997. And if you extend that on out to about 2008, the start of the economic slowdown, that number is probably closer to 30%. So when we look at coastal areas, there are 5.19 times more commercial and industrial activity per land area in the coastal zone, and 5.19 times more people in the coastal zone, which means we are crowded in the coastal zone. And attendant with that is all the pollution that emanates from that commercial and activity of living in the coastal zone. This makes our coastal zones places of dynamic change because of that profound statistic. And as a result of the pollution that may occur, there may be both impacts to ecosystem and human health. This influx of people and the associated development of our coastal zone has transformed the landscape ecology of many of our coastal regions, causing major changes in the hydrological cycle. And this in turn affects the delivery and transport of water to coastal watersheds, and also things that are in those waters, things such as chemical contaminants, nutrients, and microbes. This little cartoon sort of captures it. We have land use runoff that can affect both coastal habitats, water quality, natural resources, and man, all part of that coastal ecosystem. So today I'm going to be talking about the impacts of harmful algal blooms, infectious microbes, and contaminants of emerging concern as we talk in this lecture about how that may interface with climate change. This is a little graph from the Harvard School of Public Health, and basically what it shows looking from 1970 to 1996 is the increase in the number of major environmental events in our coastal zone. You'll notice that back panel are harmful algal blooms. You can see the tremendous upsurge and uptick in harmful algal blooms in this time period as we entered into the 21st century. And so you can really begin to see also coral bleaching events, fish kills, things such as that, marine mammal strandings, all of which have increased over the past few years. So how are our coastal areas doing? If we go to EPA's Coastal Condition Report, 44% of our estuarine ecosystems were impaired primarily due to non-point source pollution. Suzanne Bricker at NOAA has found that 2/3 of our estuaries are highly eutrophic. That is, we have high levels of nutrients that can cause excessive plant growth, hypoxia, lack of oxygen, and things such as this. In 2005, we had more than 35,000 beach advisories, and 40% of our shellfish harvest areas have impairments due to man-made pollution, primarily human bacteria. The greatest rate of change for coastal development is in the southeast United States, the area from Cape Kennedy north to Cape Hatteras, followed by the Pacific and Gulf of Mexico regions. We have been studying urbanization in this region for the last 20 to 25 years and have conducted 3 major studies: the Urbanization and Southeast Estuary Study, called the USIS Study, the LUCIS Study, the Land Use Coastal Ecosystem Study, and the Tidal Creek Project. The USIS study really began on an ecosystem level wide basis, comparing a pristine area north inland of NOAA National Estuarine Research Reserve with the most urbanized area in terms of commercial urbanization, Murrells Inlet, located at the southern end of Myrtle Beach's Grand Strand. There are no standard industrial code industries in that area, only residential and urban development associated with tourism, which is a type of development that's now going on in that area. We then moved from that study to studying larger estuarine systems, riverine estuarine systems, looking at the interconnections between tidal creeks, tidal rivers, bays and estuaries, as we understand the dynamics throughout our entire ecosystem. And what we learned at the end of the day was it's the first order streams leading from land where you get the most pollution. That is where you get the greatest loading of nutrients, chemical contaminants, and microbes. Also, it's where the earliest life history stages of your fish and shellfish, which also happen to be the most sensitive to these pollutants, reside and start life. Thus, if we protect the tidal creeks, by default, we protect the rest of the estuary. So if we win the battle on urbanization by maintaining quality in tidal creeks, we win the battle everywhere. Now, this is a graph of population growth in South Carolina. The 3 fastest growing cities on the East Coast are all located in South Carolina: Myrtle Beach, Charleston, and Hilton Head, latest census. The red line is the population growth curve for Horry County, where Myrtle Beach is located. You'll notice in 1980 we had about 100,000 people. By the year 2000, 20 years later, we had double that population. So we have population doubling times in this region on the order of 20 years. The only other place on the planet that has doubling times like that is sub-Sahara Africa, and there they are not making attempts to maintain the environmental quality, to protect the environment. So we're really in the real bullseye of urbanization when we look at this in terms of development. The other thing that happens is for every 1% increase in population, there is a 5% increase in urban footprint, because we tend to sprawl and spread our urban developments out. This is a map for Charleston, the second largest growing city. And here we see in 1973 we had 70 square miles of urban area. Today we're sitting at 600, and by 2030 we'll have 10 times that urban land footprint. What that means, when you have a 20-year population doubling time, your urban footprint doubling time is 5 years. So that means 5 years we're paving paradise and putting up a parking lot and transforming the landscape ecology dramatically. That's what it means. Now, one of the lessons we learned very early is because of the way we build that this problem occurs. Most developments today are 1/8 of an acre lot or smaller. The numbers you see in those bars with those different lot sizes is the percent imperviousness that results. When you have a small lot, 1/8 of an acre or smaller, you end up with 65% impervious cover because of the footprint of the house, the driveways, and the sidewalks. And that means you're going to greatly accelerate runoff off your lots as a result. And this cartoon just sort of makes the point. In a natural system, about 10% of the precipitation runs off. As you go to 10 to 20% impervious cover, you double that amount of runoff. As you go to 35 to 50%, you have a 300% increase in runoff. And as you go to a highly urbanized area like a city, there's a 5-fold increase in runoff. Now, what we know is we have now learned through these studies, and we could have saved a lot of money by learning this early, but it took a while to get the data, is imperviousness pretty well predicts environmental quality when it comes to water quality. And so what we know is anytime we get above 10% impervious cover in a watershed, you begin to see alterations in water quality. Anything over 30%, you begin to see loss of ecosystem services. These are the concentrations of some of the chemicals and microbial and nutrients that we see in stormwater runoff as it leaves the land. And I'll point out to you at the very bottom the fecal coliform bacteria. The safe shellfish harvest standard is 14 bacteria per 100 mils. We're measuring levels 1,000 times that entering into our estuarine systems. So therefore, shellfish harvestability, remember how 40% of our shellfish beds are impaired? Well, there's your reason, right there. So this little four-tiered pie represents 25 years of my life, and so you can see I live a pretty simple life. So if we take a look, the first graph is a duh moment. If you have increased population density, you have increased impervious cover. Duh. Okay, that's not too surprising, right? But the next graph over on the top right is the amount of volume of flow and the rate of flow of runoff when we have a storm event. And so I want you to think about your backyard with a garden hose. If I have that hose turned on real low with the spray nozzle off and it's running just real slowly in the backyard, that water runs in, soaks in the ground, doesn't wash any of the sediment away, and so things are okay. Well, that's what we see in a forested watershed. But when we move into an urban and a suburban watershed, now you've hooked the hose up, you got it on wide open, and you got the spray nozzle on jet, and you're washing the sediment away in your backyard. 89% of the contaminants that generally are loaded to most estuaries are loaded on sediments. They hitchhike the nutrients, the chemical contaminants, and the microbes. That's why we have retention ponds to try to capture that and settle the sediments out to minimize that loading. But basically what we see in the bottom two slides is the high correlation between increased levels of fecal coliform bacteria and imperviousness and also increased levels of chemical contaminants as measured by sediment quality guidelines for cumulative contaminant loading. So there in a nutshell is what we know about urbanization. And we can pretty well tell you by designing a watershed and not exceeding that impervious cover so you don't exceed the assimilative capacity, whether or not you will be successful in maintaining environmental conditions. We've captured all of this in a little conceptual model. So basically we've got impervious cut points. And so our drivers are increased population density, altered land cover, and increased imperviousness. This can lead to impaired water quality and hydrography, chemical pollution, microbial pollution, changes in ecosystem function. And then finally, to the far right, if we get above 30% impervious cover, we begin to see loss of ecosystem services. Why does everybody want to live at the coast? They want to recreate in the environment. They want to swim and they want to eat seafood. And those are the two amenities that attract them. So it's those very ecosystem services that attract people that are most vulnerable to urbanization. Well, that's a lecture and a half right there, right? But now what about this thing called climate change? Well, let me make one other point about urbanization before we go to that. What urbanization really does, and when we really look at most of our pollution problems, it's really where we have altered four of our major biogeochemical cycles. With urbanization, we've altered the hydrological cycle, we've altered the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, which causes eutrophication. And so what we really see in many urban settings is these types of problems with eutrophication and things such as this. The other thing we do with urbanization is we make a URI environment, that is URI-haline, URI-thermal. We make it even more URI with urbanization. We make it hyper-URI. When I say URI, that is highly variable. Now we come along and add climate change, which now adds another variable that can make extremes even more profound. So we're adding extreme range upon extreme range. So what I want to do the rest of our talk is to talk about how climate change can interact with urbanization and talk about some things that are pretty important. So I'm going to start with this slide. You've all seen this. These are the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, in red, dark blue, the oceans, and the accompanying change in pH due to ocean acidification due to the absorption of the CO2 in the oceans. that can lead to problems in many marine habitats. Present levels of CO2 are right at about 400 parts per million, about a 25% increase since the start of the Industrial Revolution, 12% increase or more since 1960. We estimate in the 20th century we saw a 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit shift globally, depends on where you are. And the projections are for a 1.5 to 4.5 degree Fahrenheit shift due to CO2 by 2050 at a bare minimum. If we take a look at most of the greenhouse gases that are responsible for this, by volume CO2 is the most, 55%. The chlorofluorocarbons due to refrigerants are 24%, but on a mole per mole basis or a molecule per molecule basis, one molecule of CFC absorbs 12,000 times more heat than a molecule of CO2. Methane, 15% of the total, and again 20 times more potent than CO2 as a heat absorber. And then finally nitric oxide, due to combustion of cars, about 6%. And I'll point out the other thing, the CFCs are increasing at a rate of 5%, which means they're going to double every 20 years. And it's not getting any cooler, is it? So that means that number is going to go up. So if you want to learn about the climate, the ultimate place to go is the IPCC, this website, and I'm going to refer to information in both the 2009 and the 2014 reports. And the website's right there if you want to learn more. Now these are some slides from Dr. Tom Peterson. These are projected CO2 emission scenarios. So I'm going to start with the very top left figure. You'll notice there's a little orange box at the very left of that figure, so we've blown that up. The first thing Dr. Peterson likes to talk about is the models have a high emission, low emission, ultra high emission, and then a stabilization. They're all different color coded. And then the actual observations are in black. So what Dr. Peterson would say, first of all, if you look at the current model, our observed CO2 levels are much higher than the models. Thus, he likes to make the point the models are highly conservative in predicting future CO2 emissions because they're below the actual observed levels today. So if we're making a mistake, it's below, not above. Second 2 points Dr. Peterson would make, a molecule of CO2 emitted today, any amount emitted today, 100 years from now, 33% of it will still remain. And 1,000 years from now, 20% of it still remains. Thus, decisions we make today have long-term profound consequences in terms of the amount of CO2 that will be in the environment. Now, climate may directly affect the growth, survival, persistence, distribution, transmission, and virulence of disease-causing organisms. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and also harmful algal blooms, so we'll talk about that. It may also affect the disease vectors that vector disease, things like mosquitoes, and it can also be major factors of temperature extreme that can interact with chemical contaminants to change the transfer rates of chemicals within the environment. So let's start by talking about increased temperature, and let's talk about the increased melting of polar ice. We heard a little bit about that yesterday, so let's talk about some of that. Let's talk about temperature extremes. Under the climate scenarios, currently Washington, D.C. has 1 day per year over 100 degrees. It's projected that will increase to 14 days per year, but I really think that's dependent on how often Congress is in session. Now, Dallas, Texas has 19 days, and it's projected to go to 78 days, which means the entire summer. How many people remember in 2013 we had 42 straight days in Dallas above 100, and they hit 70 days for the year in 2013. So some of these projections we're already starting to see. The Midwest is going to have considerably less rain. The breadbasket is going to shift north into Minnesota and southern Canada. Because of the high CO2, our crops are not going to fare as well. The P3 plants, they won't have as much protein. The weeds, on the other hand, are going to outcompete our food crops because they like the high CO2. That means we'll have to use more herbicides to control the weeds because they're going to be more virulent. And then also, because the insect pests have to eat so much of the crop to get their protein, that means they're going to have to eat even more of the crop to satisfy their protein demands, which means we'll have to use more insecticides. So those are both long-term projections that we'll probably see. Now, these are the climate models that NOAA has projected for the IPCC. Let's start with the present day, looking at 1993 to 2007. Our scale, this is in degrees Fahrenheit, 1, 2, 3 degrees. So you can see in that time period from 1993 to 2007, a slight increase of 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, with the greatest increase in Alaska toward the poles, where the temperature is much higher because we shift heat away from the equator. Now we see the near-term projection of 2011 to 29. We now see levels of up to 6 degrees, 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit in Alaska. You'll see for the main United States about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we have the low and high emission scenario mid-century into the century. And you can see by the end of the century, we're well over a 10 degree Fahrenheit projection increase, particularly in the Arctic regions because of the redistribution of heat by oceanic circulation. Dr. Peterson loves this concept of moving states to explain what does this mean to you. All of you folks here in New England, by the end of the century, you're going to have the same climate as Raleigh, North Carolina. That's what the projection would be. If you're in Chicago, you're going to have the same climate as Dallas, Texas has today. So this is a concept of what we call moving states to sort of let people understand what these scenarios and forecasts really mean. Now, if you read through the report, a lot of tables, you can't read that, but I've tried to summarize the big thing, and there are a lot of things there. What I'm going to tell you is, just like I said, urbanization makes things more variable, more extreme. That's what climate does. It can increase the frequency of tropical storms, drought, heavy precipitation event, heat waves, increased days of warmer nights during the winter particularly. Overall, increased weather extremes. And this slide looks at seawater temperatures from 1970 to 2004. This scale is in degrees centigrade. The dark red is 3.5 degrees centigrade. And you can see from 1970 to 2004, we have already begun to see almost a 3.5 degree centigrade shift in the Arctic region in particular. And in fact, when we look at the Arctic, we see that temperatures in the Arctic are rising twice as fast as anywhere else in the world. The average temperature in Antarctica has increased 6 degrees centigrade over the last 30 years, just to give you an idea of the scale and pace of change. So this puts many species such as polar bears, Adele penguins, and walruses that are dependent on that ice pack and for survival and their ecology at peril. More than 279 species are at risk, and therefore we have to be very concerned. While there's been a lot of attention focused on the loss of the ice, what about what's in the ice? All the air pollution from the Industrial Revolution that has been transported to the Arctic, much of it has been sequestered in that ice and taken out of the active ecology of the systems by storing it in that ice. So if you begin to melt that ice, we're going to now release all that air pollution from the last 300 years in a very short time period. So if you take a look, for example, that means for lead, we have more than 214 parts per trillion of lead in that ice that will be released. We're going to have up to 8 parts per million mercury, 36 parts per trillion cadmium. If we look on the organic pollution side, it might surprise you that the most commonly measured compound in polar bears is an insecticide that's used to treat stink bugs on tomatoes, endosulfan. It has a very high Henry law constant, which means it likes to be transported to the Arctic. The levels are up to 360 parts per trillion. The water quality criteria to protect shrimp and fish is 8 parts per trillion. This is well above that. We also see chloropyrifos, and by the way, endosulfan has caused more coastal fish kills than all other pesticides combined. Chloropyrifos, the water quality criteria is 6 parts per trillion. We're looking at 16.2 parts per trillion, nearly 3 times the water quality criteria, again to protect fish and invertebrates. Atrazine, about 2 parts per trillion, right at the Canadian standard. And then we also see high levels of DDT. In fact, if we look at the West Antarctic ice sheet, it's losing ice at a rate of 210 gross tons per year. That's putting anywhere from 1 to 4 kilograms of DDT into that bay and embayment right there in Antarctica. You may have all heard how krill are disappearing in the Arctic. And they're attributing that to the loss of habitat, and that may very well be true. But I can tell you that if these compounds are in the water, the most sensitive species will be the invertebrates. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how these contaminants that are released may affect thermal tolerance in many of our marine species. This is a paper by Petra et al. Published in Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, in which they used low doses of endosulfan and chlorpyrifos and exposed them to 4 species of freshwater fish to look at whether it would affect their thermal tolerance. So let's use the rainbow trout. Everybody's probably familiar with that. The normal thermal range for the rainbow trout is 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. If you expose rainbow trout to either one of these pesticides, you're going to lower their upper thermal tolerance somewhere between 5 and 6 degrees, which means at the time we're turning up the environmental temperatures, we're turning down the thermostat on these animals, which means they're going to die rather quickly. This type of effect can lead to, we were talking about extinctions yesterday, this can lead to significant alterations in range extension of species because of the fact they're going to be much more sensitive to these thermal stresses. The next thing I want to talk about is shifts, ecological shifts in species of organisms. And the most simple to start with are plants. Everybody knows what plants are like. And so if we take a look at this little map starting in 1990, these are those color codes indicate plants that are in what we call different plant hardiness zones. You'll notice we have only a few zone 7s right at that little tip of Missouri and some 6s, but you'll notice by 2006, all of those plants in that little tip of Missouri have now moved up into Missouri. And you can see by 2090, they're going to move way up into Ohio and all these states. You'll also see the little zone 6, which is light green, is now already moving up into the Great Lakes. So this is very good indications of changing of species ranges and distributions. And this is all related to thermal tolerances. Another organism that we're real concerned about are Vibrio bacteria in coastal areas. Now, Vibrio cholera, you're probably all very familiar with. Vibrio vulnificus and Vibrio parahemolyticus are his first and second cousins. Vibrio vulnificus accounts for 95% of all deaths from seafood. It's a terrible disease. You get these lesions. The only thing they can do is amputate, and the fatality rate is well over 60%. Not a lot they can do once you get one of these infections. Vibrio parahemolyticus, y'all had an outbreak of that along the East Coast in 2013 in shellfish. Because it started right up here in New England, all the way down to North Carolina. I think there were 16,000 cases that year. We have 8,000 on the slide. Rita Caldwell at the University of Maryland has found that globally, the rate of Vibrio infections worldwide has increased by 41% in the last 10 years. And most significantly, the rate of antibiotic resistance within these Vibrios has increased by 31%. Elevated temperature turns on antibiotic resistant genes in these microbes, making them much more difficult to treat infections and to control the problem. The other thing is I think the Vibrios are really kind of perhaps one of our indicator species for climate change. Between 1996 and 2001, there was an 80% increase in the number of cases of Vibrios. And Vibrios remain one of the 3 bacterial illnesses on CDC's list that is still increasing in terms of occurrence. Particularly what we are seeing with the Vibrios is a movement away from gastroenteritis associated with seafood to wound infections. One of the big examples with the Vibrios is Vibrio parahemolyticus. We had a 1,000-kilometer range extension of Vibrio parahemolyticus. This is normally a pathogen found in the Gulf of Mexico, now showing up in the Gulf of Alaska. Its normal northern range was Vancouver, now it's in southern Alaska. And it's interesting, they ate shellfish from Alaska, which was on the cruise ship that got people sick. And it's interesting, the average daily temperature was greater than 15 degrees C for the entire month of July and August, leading to the infection, and that's the first time that's been recorded. And 15 degrees C is the minimum incubation temperature for Vibrios. So we really see the correlations here. Now, as I said, these Vibrios are really starting to change the dynamics. For example, if you look at vulnificus, about half of the cases are now wound infections. Alginolyticus and Vibrio damsella, almost all the illnesses are wound infections. Now, I want to show this next slide. The seasonality of these infections is very interesting. Usually this occurs from May through September during the warm months of the year because it is a warm water organism. However, I want to show you some data that really shows a real clear signal for climate change. So what I have is I have the months of April and November. The slash lines are the number of days above 20 degrees C in shellfish harvest areas in the U.S. And then the gray are the number of cases of illness per ton of oysters harvested in the U.S. Okay? And I've got two time periods, a 10-year or 8-year period from 1989 to 97, and then 98 to 2007. So what we see is, you'll notice if we start in April, we went from about 70% of the days above 20 to now almost 90% of the days above 20 degrees C. And you'll notice the number of cases of illness increased fourfold during that 10-year time period difference. Just that slight change in temperature. You'll see the same thing in November. We go from about 40% to nearly 60% days above 20 degrees C, and you see a doubling of the number of cases of illness for the month of November. So what that means now is Vibrios are an illness now that occur all the way from April through November. And with increasing temperature, they'll increase with more regularity and frequency. This slide is an example of where these cases occur in North Carolina. This happens to be the area on the East Coast with the highest rate of sea level rise of any place on the East Coast. And if you take a look in North Carolina, and we compare other foodborne illnesses, they tend to cluster in cities such as Charlotte and Raleigh, where the population centers are. All of those cases of Vibrios were not from foodborne illness. All but one case were wound infections. So this is clearly because this is a disease of coming in contact with the marine environment. I want to talk also about harmful algal blooms in the same vein. And these are a list of all the different harmful algal blooms that cause fish kills, cause marine mammal strandings, cause closure of beaches, and cause closure of drinking water intakes in our Great Lakes, as we heard about in Toledo last August. 500,000 people without drinking water. This is a species, Alexandrium cantonella, that's found in Puget Sound. It grows when the temperatures are above 13 degrees centigrade. It grows and closes a shellfish harvest in Seattle. Under normal conditions, it closes the shellfish harvest for about 109 days. But you can plug in the climate change models, and here's what will happen. This will go from 109 days to 181 days with climate change, which means you're literally going to lose your shellfish harvest in this area for a large portion of the time. And that's the same thing we see with the Vibrios. By the range extending to longer periods, we now have problems that are not intermittent, but more temporally, much more longer. Another example are the freshwater algae, the cyanobacteria. If we take a look at cases of illness in drinking water and surface water, chemical poisonings are very dominant in both of these, and most of these are from microcystin, the toxin produced from that as a blue-green algae. This is what these algae look like. I've got superimposed on this slide a map of the Falls Creek Reservoir, which is the drinking water source for the city of Raleigh, 500,000 people. And those red stars are station locations that the city has done some pretty interesting climate adaptability, which I'll show you in just a minute. Now, EPA did a study looking at these cyanobacteria. There are 123,000 lakes greater than 10 acres in size in the U.S., and 33% of them have these harmful algal blooms in them. In Ohio, where we had the problem with Toledo, 37% of the lakes, right on that national average, had blooms. And again, the water supply was affected in Toledo. EPA has just issued new guidelines, much lower levels for children, because this does affect the brain. The target organ is the brain and central nervous system. So we clearly know there's a linkage with urbanization and climate change with this problem. Now, what the city of Raleigh has done, they have put in these things that you see here, which are plankton sensors that can actually detect the toxin in the water. So as the bloom moves across that lake I showed you there with that map, you'll notice the bloom in the middle of the lake is here. This is the last station where the water intake is. The bloom is now at 6 meters depth. What they will do is they will move the water intake up above the bloom and bypass the bloom. That saved the city $10 million in treatment costs last year. So somebody has to pay for that, to have safe drinking water. The monitoring program to do this was about $500,000. That's a pretty good return on your investment. And that's a great example of climate adaptability. This problem will cost $200 million to fix, to reduce the pollution in that Falls Lake Reservoir. There's similar problems in the Neuse, the Yadkin, and other North Carolina watersheds. When you add all that up, the total cost for restoring those watersheds in North Carolina, as we cram more and more people that need that drinking water, it's going to approach the restoration costs we've estimated for the Chesapeake Bay. This is a big problem. So what NOAA has done, they have begun to put out a harmful algal bloom forecast, which links up satellite data that can detect the bloom by sensing chlorophyll on the boots on the ground for observations through their National Phytoplankton Monitoring Network at 200 locations, and then also putting these sensors in the ground, and they can then put out a forecast to protect the public. NOAA has also developed Vibrio forecasts now for the Chesapeake Bay, and we're doing these for other estuaries to again warn the public to stay out of the waters when there are high probabilities of exposure for these wound infections. Now, next thing I want to talk about is sea level rise, and I'll just real quickly talk about this. This is the instrument record, and you can see the projections for the future. Normally in 100 years, sea level rise is 4 to 8 inches on average. With the climate change models, we're estimating anywhere from 28 to 40 inches. And so just to kind of illustrate this point about sea level rise, that little first picture is a picture right outside of the lab I used to run in Charleston. That was after about a 2-inch rain on a high tide, spring tide in the summertime. And so I'll make this point, even Charleston's finest could not get out of the way when there's nowhere for the water. They call it the low country, and there's a reason for that. There is nowhere for the water to go. And so when tides rise like this, where will the water go? It's going to go in the streets. So infrastructure protection becomes very critical. I want to show you a little quick study that sort of looks at this from a different perspective. This is a watershed just north of Charleston in Winyah Bay near Georgetown, South Carolina. And what I have plotted on here in yellow and white are Vibrio bacteria levels for different Vibrio species. And the drinking water intake for the city of Georgetown is located right in here, right above what's called the bridge in WR1. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some work we've done here to sort of forecast Vibrio projections for the future. We know that Vibrios, both species, are highly correlated peak levels with highest temperature. And we also see peak abundances right about 10 parts per thousand salinity. So what that allows us to do is to develop an algorithm to predict these Vibrios using salinity, or conductivity, turbidity, and temperature. We then have been able to take the 13 global climate change models and project how much rain there will be in the future using a PRISM model and interface that with, and what it says for the Southeast, there's not going to be any rain, it's going to be drought. And so we can interface that with a sea level rise model that actually will talk about saltwater intrusion into that bay, because this is a source of drinking water in this area. So we are able to put together this global circulation and sea level model dynamic through a neural network model to predict. We trained it with this historic period and now have run that out through around 2050. And so what we show you here is these are, whenever you see one of these peaks, that means you can't drink the water. So with no sea level rise, this is what we project will be the future there in terms of when we cannot drink the water. with 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot sea level rise, that's the frequency with which we will not be able to drink the water use that for drinking water. Similarly, we have made predictions of Vibrio optimum growth conditions for Vibrio. So when you see those peaks, and what I'll just skip to, 1, 2, and 3 foot sea level rise, we're going to see 10 times the number of Vibrios in the future. Vibrios cost us right now $30 million a year in healthcare cost. That number can go to $300 million if this is true, not counting inflation. Okay, also more extreme weather, particularly runoff and drought. And I know I'm talking to the choir here. These are the statistics for the United States from 1958 to 2007. Y'all are seeing 67% more high intense rainfall in that time period. You're leading the pack here in the Northeast U.S. And these are the long-term projections for the future. Even in the Southeast, we've only seen a modest 20% increase in heavy intensity rainfall. So what that means is when it rains, it pours. Now, the future scenarios, though, are for drought for the Southeast. The brown or white means drought. So you see, through most of the Southeast, we're not going to have rainfall. You guys are going to have the rain. So that means, though, when it does rain, again, with that heavy intensity rainfall, for us in the South, the number of antecedent days of dry weather where we get dry deposition of all these chemicals, the pollution load will be much higher when it does rain. So that could have some profound consequences as well. We mentioned earlier with our urban runoff work the problem of increased runoff. And I just want to real quickly remind you that in every 8 months in the U.S. we have the same amount of oil being discharged off our roadways as was spilled in the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And if we put with that the other chemical contaminants like contaminants of emerging concern, pharmaceutical and personal care products, there are lots of things that are going to be entering our waterways in the future of great concern. I'm a member of a panel for the state of California where we have put together a top 10 list of chemicals that you want to monitor for emerging contaminants. They include flame retardants, both the fluorinated and brominated flame retardants, along with 3 contemporary use pesticides, and also triclosan, which is the hand soaps everybody uses in the bathroom, because that's the most frequent antibiotic. One of the things we see, though, that is a real concern with the current toxicology we do for many of these chemicals is as we typically test conditions under what we call standard temperature, that's 20 degrees C and 20 parts per thousand salinity. And that's that black line that we see there. You'll notice that when we test this little grass shrimp model with high temperature and high salinity, it's 4 times more sensitive than it would normally be under normal conditions. So what that means is these extreme temperatures, our pesticide risk assessments are woefully, and for other chemical contaminants, are woefully inadequate or unpredictable. Because you'll see, as I show you here, while that was more toxic, this compound, which is resmethrin, this was a herbicide, this is resmethrin, an insecticide, just the opposite is true. Actually, the green says the higher salinity is less toxic. The combination of high salinity and temperatures does still shift the line to the left, making it more toxic. Now, we see that these chemicals like flame retardants and antibiotics are found at about 48%, 60% of the sites in the U.S. These are levels of some of the flame retardants we see in dolphins. You'll notice that the levels in dolphins rival the levels of these chemicals that we see in humans that actually manufacture these products. Also, we have concerns, and I'll close on this last note about antibiotics. The antibiotics as emerging contaminants are unlike any of the other contaminants of concern because they have a different paradigm. With most chemicals, it's the lower the dose, or excuse me, the higher the dose, the greater the effect. With the antibiotics, the opposite is true. These are levels of tetracycline found in the sewage treatment plant, which we then pour out onto a golf course that finds its way into the estuary. And that is a very common practice in many parts of the Southeast United States. This slide really illustrates this point. If we take the tetracycline, which is an antibiotic, and give it to a naive strain of E. coli bacteria, they have no antibiotic resistance. It takes 24 hours or 72 generations of bacteria before you get the arisal of the first resistant pathogen. At 10% of that dose, it's still 24 hours or 72 hours. But you'll know with a 100th, 1,000th, and 1/10,000th lower doses, you get much quicker arisal of antibiotic resistance, which means the lower the dose, the greater the effect. That's why the doctor always tells you, make sure you take the full prescription. We have been looking at this problem. We know that, for example, in Charleston Harbor, we have 39% of our dolphins have antibiotic-resistant pathogens in their blowholes and rectums when we do swabs on them. We have measured these antibiotics throughout the U.S., and I want to close on this last little example that I think really underscores the importance of this issue. Now, the way in which antibiotic resistance is developed is by the development of plasmids, which are little extracellular packets of DNA. They contain the resistant genes, and the bacteria develop these and can shed these. They can also exchange them with other species of bacteria. This is a study we did in Charleston Harbor. Station 2 is a sewage treatment plant in Charleston. And so just to make a quick point, when we come into the sewage treatment plant, we have very low numbers of this gene. This is the BLAST M1 gene, which causes MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. There are now more deaths from MRSA than there are from AIDS in the U.S. That's how prevalent this problem is. So what we see here is very low levels of genes here in the raw sewage and activated sludge. But when we finally get to the final discharge of the bacteria, what we have done by chlorinating the effluent is we have selected for only resistant microbes, and those are the ones we discharge into the environment. And what's really scary, these are the levels at the outfall, and this is a log scale. These are levels in Charleston Harbor. We have levels in the sediment 1,000 times higher than in the effluent, which means this is a brand new class of genetic pollution that can be transferred to other species. Evidence of this is shown in Vibrio bacteria that we have collected. This is a number of 360 isolates, less than 1% of the isolates. And remember, Vibrios are saltwater bacteria, even though they're human pathogens. They're actually saltwater organisms. Less than 1% have no antibiotic resistance. Some have resistance to 13 different antibiotics. Good luck if you go to the hospital with a wound infection. You better hope they get lucky in their choice. They have changed the treatment protocols now. They run a panel to find out what to give you now. So in closing, let me just close on this. Right now, these marine pathogens cost us $900 million a year in healthcare cost. $300 million to beach closures from acquired infections while you swim, $30 million from the Vibrios, shellfish, and seafood, the others. This is a paper done by the Prime Minister of Great Britain because of his concern about healthcare costs. Today, that little blue line, these are all the leading causes of death in the world today. Cancer is number one. You'll notice that right now we have 700,000 antibiotic-resistant infections. By 2050, we are projecting from this O'Neill study that we will be more cases of that than we currently have for cancer deaths. And this will cost globally 6% of the global GDP just to treat this problem. This will cause problems with transplants, cesarean sections. I can go through the list of healthcare procedures you can't do without adequate antibiotics. This is a recipe for disaster. So in closing, let me just say, what are our options? Drive fuel-efficient cars. That's why the President wants a 54 mile per gallon fleet average. That'll reduce CO2s by 40%. Use renewables, plant forests, plant trees. We could replace power plants, but as you can see, it would cost too much. So in closing, let me just throw this last slide up. Promise I'll close here. This is a book, if any of you want some great reading, the best $12 you'll spend. It's called The Great Transition. It's by Lester Brown. Lester Brown's 81 years old. This is his 51st book. 51 books. And what he talks about is the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Is it happening? Well, let me give you some stats out of this book. Maybe this will be, and I'm not getting a royalty on the book. Denmark and Spain right now are producing 20 to 34% of their energy from renewables, solar, wind. Texas is producing more power now from wind than they are from nuclear. Iowa and South Dakota, 26% of their energy from renewables. The transition is occurring. The other evidence of this, from 2010 to 2014, we reduced the number of coal-powered generating plants in the U.S. from 500 to 343. That is a 25% reduction. 1994 to 2013, the number of gas stations in the U.S. declined by 25%. The transition is here, it is happening, and even the Chinese have reduced their coal production use by 18%. Read the book, there is hope for the future, and thank you, and I apologize for going over.